Hello and welcome to a special edition of Decision NYC with Ben Max here on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max, your host and editor of Gotham Gazette. The 2022 elections are over and we are dissecting the results, what happened and why, and what comes next, even as we await final word on a few races across the country that will finalize the balance of power in the U.S. House of Representatives. Here in New York, it was overall a very good election for Republicans and a bad one for Democrats, though Democrats did stave off catastrophe in a narrow win in the governor's race. Democrat Kathy Hochul, the first woman to be governor of New York, won election to her first term in that role after she ascended in August 2021 after the resignation of Governor Andrew Cuomo amid a series of scandals. She defeated Republican nominee Lee Zeldin, the congressman from Long Island, who came closer than any GOP gubernatorial nominee in the last 2 decades. Hochul and her lieutenant governor running mate, Antonio Delgado, won over Zeldin and his running mate, Allison Esposito, by a margin of about 53% to 47%. Roughly 6 million of New York State's 13 million plus registered voters cast a ballot in the race for governor, somewhere around 45% turnout, with wide variations in different regions of the state. In other statewide results, Democrats kept their seats with Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, Attorney General Letitia James, and U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer, all victorious over their Republican challengers, though again, often by smaller margins than many would have expected in a state where Democrats outnumber Republicans 2-1, and where Republicans are even slightly outnumbered by independent voters, those who are registered to vote but not enrolled with any political party. While Republicans significantly overperformed expectations statewide, it was in legislative races where they scored key victories. In all New York districts after the once-a-decade redistricting after the U.S. Census, lines were redrawn, and there were elections now for New York's 26 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, down 1 from the current 27, and all 150 state assembly seats and 63 state Senate seats. Republicans flipped several assembly seats in New York City, especially in southern Brooklyn, and state Senate seats on Long Island and elsewhere, though Democrats made up for some of those losses in other parts of the city and state. Even if slightly diminished, Democrats will retain a very large majority in both houses of the state legislature. But most consequentially, Republicans won a series of swing congressional districts in New York that appear set to help the GOP take a slim majority in the lower chamber of Congress, while Democrats retain a slim majority in the U.S. Senate under Schumer's leadership. And both houses are set to work, of course, with Democratic President Joe Biden over the next 2 years. In New York, Republicans basically held their current congressional seats and swung several on Long Island and in the Hudson Valley, including the defeat of Democrat Sean Patrick Maloney, the chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. What is currently a New York congressional delegation of 19 Democrats and 8 Republicans will become a delegation of 15 Democrats and 11 Republicans. The results in New York have sent shockwaves through the Democratic Party, both here and nationally, and given Republicans a major jolt here and nationally. The results in New York were actually an exception to the larger trends in the 2022 elections across the country, where Democrats overperformed and Republicans underperformed. So there's been a lot of finger pointing within both parties as the election results are digested and dissected. Here in New York, Republicans are buoyed and they're hopeful, while Democrats are doing some soul searching and reconsidering party leadership. Today on the show, I'm going to be joined by 2 great guests to analyze the results of the 2022 elections here in New York. What exactly happened and why? What does Lee Zeldin's strong showing in the governor's race and Republican wins in a number of districts mean? What were the keys to Hochul's win, but why did she underperform? And what's next for Republicans and Democrats in New York and beyond? First, I'll be joined in a moment by Republican Joe Borelli, the minority leader of the New York City Council, who represents a conservative Staten Island district and has been a major backer of Lee Zeldin, Donald Trump, and other fellow Republicans. And he helped lead a super PAC supporting Zeldin in this year's gubernatorial race. Borelli has been among the most ubiquitous spokespeople for New York Republicans, and we're pleased to get his perspective here today. Then, in the second half of this 30-minute show, I'll be joined by L. Joy Williams, a prominent Democratic strategist and the president of the Brooklyn NAACP, whose name has been floated as a potential next leader of the New York State Democratic Party. So stay tuned for L. Joy Williams on the Democrats. New York City Council Minority Leader Joe Borelli is with me now. Thank you for joining me. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So you have to be feeling good about how Republicans performed in New York in these elections here in 2022. Big picture, what went right for the GOP here in New York?
Well, we had a trifecta of come together essentially, where we had the right candidate. Lee Zeldin was unquestionably the right candidate of the four people engaged in the primary. We had a candidate who was able to raise enough money himself to be competitive. And there were outside PACs that equalized the playing field to what the Democratic incumbent had. And the third thing is the issues were consistently on our side, consistent in almost every single poll. Crime and the economy led as the number one issue affecting New Yorkers. And most people felt that the Republican Party would do better on both of those issues. So it was really that trifecta which caused us to have as many victories as we did statewide, although unfortunately we did come up short.
Do you have a sense yet as to who made up the Republican voters for Lee Zeldin? There's obviously a very strong turnout among the Republican base. Do you have a sense at this point, even if we don't have quite the hard numbers yet, or maybe you have some numbers to share in terms of how well he was able to do with those independent voters and even pulling Democrats to his side? Do you have a sense of that?
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, just the raw numbers would indicate that it has to be disaffected Democrats from the suburbs. Suffolk County generated more votes than Brooklyn, and it's half the size, a little more than half the size. When you look at the actual enrollment numbers in a place like Suffolk County, you see that there's no other possibility but for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of disaffected Democrats in every precinct just switching their allegiance from the party that once really stood for the working class, the middle class, sort of the outer borough, rough and tumble sorts of New York City, to a far left, woke, ideological, demagogual party that doesn't really agree with the majority of New York voters.
Well, that's a little bit hard to say when the statewide Democratic ticket all won, even if by narrow margins.
No, it is because you saw it's not something that's hard to say when you look at who the Democratic Party continues to elect. In most of these races, it's the Democratic primary that chooses the person who gets elected. So the bulk of the Democrats who are elected to represent us end up being much further left than the sort of broader body politic. I think when you had this statewide race, you really did see New York break, obviously less than 50-50. If it was more than 50-50 in my favor, we'd be talking about Governor Zeldin right now. Sure. But you saw it almost come 50-50. 5 out of 10 people were sort of unhappy with the general direction of the Democratic Party.
You said in your initial answer here that Lee Zeldin was undoubtedly the right candidate. So let me come back to that. He obviously put forward a tremendously focused, aggressive, assertive campaign. He was going, even before he won the primary, he was going all over the state running a really hard campaign, was the favorite in the primary, had some prominence from being a congressman from Long Island, of course. Is there not an argument to be made that to get over that final hump and actually win, it would have perhaps made more sense to have a more moderate Republican candidate? You talked about Democrats being dominated by the left. Here you have a more conservative Republican winning the primary. And what's your assessment here? Was he tripped up by having, anti-abortion beliefs in the past, where that was somewhere in the mix, obviously, of the election? He put out this pretty remarkable ads promising not to touch the state's abortion laws if elected. That was trying to sort of undercut that attack on him. Is there any argument to be made that a more moderate Republican could have actually won this election?
No, I don't buy that. For us, it's about turnout. We got about 2.6 million registered votes. There's only 2.7 million registered voters. For us, it was more about motivating our base and motivating independents that are sort of Republicans, but not happen to be registered. And if you come to a district like where I represent, people will wear a Trump shirt and be registered Democrats. It's really, for us, it was solidifying the turnout from the areas and regions and precincts and neighborhoods where we thought we had the best chance of getting voters. I think we lost because of people like Mark Levine, and I'll give him a shout out and I'll give him some credit.
Manhattan Borough President.
Yeah, Manhattan Borough President Mark Levine. I mean, he was the only one 2 weeks before the race came to its conclusion that was out there sounding the alarm. in that first couple of tweets he was sending out and organizing events, he sounded almost crazy. But we saw that he wasn't the crazy one, that he was seeing sort of the same numbers that we on the Zeldin side were seeing, where our turnout was going to be tremendous. Recall, I mean, Zeldin got more votes than Cuomo did in some races. Zeldin got more votes than I think any Republican gubernatorial candidate in 30 years, probably, since maybe the first Pataki run, the second Pataki run. So for us, it was always about generating turnout and hopefully not seeing an equal turnout on the other side. Abortion, we knew we were going to lose voters on that. I mean, there's no scenario, right? No one wants to hear someone be half pro-choice and half pro-life. This is not one of those issues where there's a lot of gray areas. And for some voters, someone who has any tendency towards pro-life just eliminates them from our possibilities as far as getting their votes. We knew that. We digested that. We accepted that and moved on. I think what Lee did was the smart move, because even your folks, the people in media, people in journalism, really couldn't challenge what he said because it was true. If he was elected governor, he can do almost nothing to change abortion laws. He would have almost no power to do that with two supermajorities in the legislature. It's not going to happen. It wasn't going to happen. And when he sort of addressed that issue, I think there was a small percentage of people, again, we're talking about small margins, maybe 5%, maybe 10%, maybe less, who said, you know what, they're right. Abortion's not a big factor in the New York race. I was in Phoenix just about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and in Arizona, after Dobbs, the law in Arizona resorted to a 1912 law that actually prosecuted people for performing abortions. So you look at a state like Arizona, where abortion is really an almost existential issue for some voters, depending on who wins the governorship. That's where you're seeing the abortion issue rise to the forefront. In New York, it was never going to change. I think people accepted that. I think the media and journalists even accepted that.
Yeah, I mean, I won't dispute much of that, but come back to this margin here. So a roughly 300,000 vote margin. There's what you just said, that maybe if more Democrats had stayed home, that gives you a better shot. Anything else you'd point to that you think, could have made the difference, other than, another $10-15 million perhaps, or, a lot more funding? Do you think there were aspects of the way that the campaign was run? Do you think there was specific messaging or platform topics that could have made the difference here? Because very clearly, this is going to be a playbook for Republicans moving forward. So in terms of getting over that hump and maybe winning the governor's race 4 years from now, any other sort of tweaks to the machinery here that you would make? Lee Zeldin ran an incredibly focused campaign, but he also wasn't necessarily offering a lot in terms of ideas for moving the state forward on, you name it, housing, transit, environment, some of these other things where maybe people were looking for a little bit more from him, maybe not.
Yeah, I just think every race that we run or every election cycle, you really have a smaller number of issues that drive voters. We can say this is a playbook, but if the crime issue subsides over the next 2 years or 4 years, crime won't be the issue that it was. If that's the case, will it be hard to have a candidate differentiate on an issue where there is such a big delta between the Democrats and Republicans? I don't know. I mean, in a sense, we got lucky, and I hate to say crime makes anyone lucky, but politically, it did make us lucky that you had two parties with two really competing visions of what the criminal justice system should look like. When you get down to, if environment is the number one issue facing New Yorkers, I think the governing party in power at that day will remain in the governing power after that election, because this is not an issue that's as kitchen table, that's as existential to family finances as crime in the economy was in this particular race.
Say a little bit more about what you did to persuade some of the persuadables, right? You had to turn out the Republican base, as you said, but you also had to persuade a whole bunch of independents and Democrats.
Let's start with Kathy Hochul's issues with New York City voters compared to Andrew Cuomo. Even Siena, about I think the August poll or the September poll of Siena voters had Kathy Hochul, 7 or 8 points lower with African Americans. I think 10 points lower with New York City residents, 8 or 9 points lower with women. So she was already starting off at a disadvantage compared to where Andrew Cuomo was 4 years earlier, with significant chunks of New York City voters. That said, we were able to target, and I mean, Zeldin did a great job of this just early on, establishing relationships with members of the Jewish community, with the Russian-speaking community, with the Asian community. I mean, those are clearly some of the targets. Again, we also had an elected official, a Democrat, a Hispanic, a prominent person from the Bronx, endorse Lee Zeldin. That's something that had never happened previously, I want to say, since the 90s, or since Governor Pataki, probably. All this, I think, adds up to inroads. Our target wasn't to win New York City. That's almost an impossibility for any Republican candidate. Our target was to get 30%. We met that goal. We have
to leave it there.
Okay.
Let's pause there. But I appreciate those thoughts. Thank you, Republican Joe Borelli, Minority Leader of the New York City Council. Really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm pleased to be joined now by L. Joy Williams, a Democratic strategist, the president of the Brooklyn NAACP, and the host of Sunday Civics on Sirius XM. Thanks for being here. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So let's talk big picture here before we dig into some specifics. What were 2 or 3, or however many you want to list, of the big reasons from your perspective that Democrats underperformed in New York while overperforming nationally? What happened in New York in the 2022 elections here that would lead Democrats to win statewide races by smaller margins than normal in these modern times, and lose several House seats, a number of state legislative seats? What happened here in New York, big picture, from your diagnosis as a Democratic strategist?
Well, big picture is something that I've been saying for some time, is that we continue to only speak to and engage a small amount of our base voters. And we have an ability really to engage more people into the process. And we kind of go, and I'm saying we collectively, because, we can get to individual races later, but, we don't continue to talk to people, to engage people, to grow who we are speaking to, and therefore who we then turn out come an election day. I think also, because we had so many elections leading up to November, right? For a lot of people, it's hard to keep momentum up, right? Because there are a lot of primaries, then the primaries off, and then it was shifted to a different time. And, sort of keeping both campaigns and candidates and others actively engaged in that process is difficult and expensive, to be honest, right? And so when you don't have a large base of a well of folks, people didn't want to confuse folks. We had the August primary, and then, going to November. So there is a lot happening in this landscape. I know right now the going theme is to blame everything on one person. We'll probably talk about that later. But there is a lot happening in the political landscape in New York that I think contribute to what we've seen. I think the other piece is, while yes, we need to do a better job as Democrats overall, because we have the room to grow, I think we also can't underestimate how obviously the changes of redistricting in certain districts impacted certain races in certain parts of the state, as well as how things were messaged or engaged across the state. And when you have someone, just thinking about Long Island, where I worked a little bit, who comes from that particular area, who is able to galvanize and energize people, granted in a different way than I would have preferred. People are enraged, engaged, and they end up turning out.
And you refer there, obviously, to the fingers being pointed at the New York State Democratic Party chair, Jay Jacobs. A lot of people calling for his replacement as the leader of the State Democratic Party. Maybe we'll come back to that in a minute. As you got at, also Jay Jacobs being from Long Island, part of the reason that people are pointing the finger at him, because of how poorly Democrats did on Long Island, how well Republicans did, and that was two straight elections after some real warnings in the 2021 local races there for county executive role and district attorney roles and so forth. But say more about Democrats and communication to voters. A lot of the issues at play in these elections were issues that, were national, that were at play a lot of other places, but seem to, for some reason in New York, work against Democrats more than elsewhere. On crime, on cost of living, inflation, the economy, that bucket of issues. Meanwhile, Democrats, of course, had some wind at their backs related to the idea of protecting abortion rights in New York, keeping what's in place, maybe expanding services elsewhere in the country, fighting against Republican rollbacks, democracy issues, these 4 or 5 big issues, but they seem to have played differently in New York. Do you have an assessment of why that was on some of these big ticket items? Was it Republicans just hammering the issue of public safety over and over again, and Democrats, especially the governor, not really responding with a good defense and going on the offense a bit more? What's your diagnosis of why in New York, where a lot of the issues were similar to around the country, things seem to have landed differently?
Well, I'm always in favor of being on the offense instead of defense. And I think overall that the way that some in our state are consistently in defensive mode in terms of issues of public safety is problematic, because we have a great story to tell as Democrats about how we're moving forward the public safety conversation. And, I would speak to and look at the base of the voters and the base of the win for the governor, which is communities of color, particularly Black voters, who are very astute at looking at the issue of public safety, who are our communities are disproportionately impacted by issues of public safety, who know very well that we can have a balanced approach about public safety in our communities, in reducing crime, gun trafficking, and things of that nature, while also not abandoning civil rights and progress on justice reform overall. It is communities of color who are closest to the problem, who live this every day, who understand the nuances of this. And so it doesn't do us a good service to ignore what communities like mine, like ours, are experiencing and can walk out the door and see. It's not, you can't dismiss it, right? But you can double down and saying, look, we've, made these investments. We've changed this law that we know has disproportionately impacted communities of color. This is how we're going to continue to address issues of public safety. And here's our next steps on that, right? And you can't dismiss what the media narrative is in the landscape as well. If you have that blanket, consistent media happening, there has to be a counter narrative, because if people aren't hearing from you, if people don't know a campaign is going on, if you're not engaged until the last couple of weeks of the election, like that is the narrative that people are responding to. There's a reason why campaigns spend as much money as they do on TV and on media overall, is because it helps shape the conversation, right? It determines what everybody should be talking about. And I think for issues like reproductive access, voters are a little smart, right? It's like, I know this is not going to be an issue in New York. And because I'm getting the political landscape analysis that I have to help in places like Pennsylvania, I have to help in Georgia, right? They're getting more coverage of what needs to happen in those states where there is a battleground than they are about what's happening in their own state. And so where people get the information of what's happening locally is what they are experiencing themselves. So I think folks were attuned to those issues such as reproductive justice, the Biden administration attempting to address and keep its promise on student loans, all of those things, but also doubling down on focusing on outside of the state and not so much as what is at stake here in the state of New York. And I think that was what's missing, is that while we're fighting yes, across the country, and New York can be a stopgap in terms of the attorney general going after the former president, going after corporations and things of that nature. There wasn't a good narrative about how we are digging down in the state of New York and why we need to also fight here. And yes, there was a little bit of, we can't let Zeldin, who is just a repeat of Trump, come here to New York, but people didn't think it was real, right? Like it was something conceptual. It wasn't something that people thought, oh, this could happen here.
At least maybe not till the very end, where there were some polls setting off some alarm bells, and there was a real rallying of some major Democratic figures coming into campaign with Governor Hochul, and some real sort of rallying the troops to make sure that people knew about the election at the 11th hour, so to speak. What did you see and not see from the governor's campaign? Do you agree with the assessment that the governor's lack of aggressive campaigning for much of the race, sort of a Rose Garden strategy, lots of TV ads, but not a lot of local outreach? Do you think that that was as big a problem as some are saying? And did it ultimately really hurt some of these state Senate candidates, state assembly candidates, and House candidates?
I would say that, sure, looking back, there are some things that I think the gubernatorial campaign could have done much more that would actually have bolstered turnout in some key places. But I think that overall, the campaign was focused on making sure that we did get to a win in terms of in the governor's column, right? So that she would not be considered as someone who did not, win an election, right? That just assumed the role. And I think there's a lot of moving parts in the state to manage, right? New York City and its political apparatus is not the same as Long Island, is not the same as Hudson Valley. And really, the candidates that come from those areas and the campaigns need to campaign differently because they have a different voter base. And I think the sophistication and making sure that we have a party apparatus that understands that you cannot run a campaign the same way in all parts of the state, and that different parts of the state need different resources, need different nuanced messaging, even though there's an overall message.
We have to leave it there with L. Joy Williams. Some interesting thoughts on the state of the Democratic Party in New York and what just happened in these elections. L. Joy Williams is a Democratic strategist, the president of the Brooklyn NAACP, and the host of Sunday Civics on Sirius XM. Thanks, L. Joy.
Thank you.
And thank you to Joe Borelli for joining me earlier in the program. And thank you for watching this special episode of Decision NYC on MNN. I'm Ben Max. See you soon.